Okay, we are going to do the part 2 of the lymphatic system. I just want to do a brief overview with you in terms of lymphoid organs. So let's take a quick look at them, do a little recap here. We have our thymus, going to be the largest of the lymphatic organs. We have some bone marrow. We have tonsils. There are four different types based on locations. We have our spleen, and we have our appendix and the Peyer's patches. So let's take a look at spleen. So we have the splenic arteries in red, or splenic veins in blue, and the hilum. Now, if we take a look at the vascular structure of the spleen, we're going to see that it's going to hold quite a bit of blood there. So it is the largest of the lymphoid organs and very rich in blood, very rich, because we have these arteries, right? Now, what are some of the functions of the spleen? The site of lymphocyte proliferation. We're going to have some immune monitoring going on there. And it's going to serve as a little bit of somewhat of a filtration, cleansing of blood that's been aged, and some platelets. We're also going to have some macrophages there. They're going to be removing some debris. Let's take a look at some gross anatomy. We have the spleen here, and above spleen, we have diaphragm. Look here, we have our kidney. So above kidney, we're going to have the adrenal gland. And you can see where we have our splenic artery, right? Now, we can't quite see the veins, splenic veins, but we can definitely see the artery, right? And below we have pancreas. So, okay, let's get a little bit more detail. What is this white pulp or red pulp? We can't see that when we look at the gross anatomy, but I can definitely tell you that this is where we have immunological function. This is the site where this is going to be occurring. Well, since you have immunological function, we're going to have a place in white pulp that contains a large amount of lymphocytes. And this appears to occur around the central arteries. It's like white pulp clusters. And they look kind of like little islands of white in a sea of red pulp. Well, remember that it's going to contain, spleen is going to contain quite a bit of blood. So what is this red pulp? Well, the site where the old blood cells and bloodborne pathogens are going to be destroyed. And that's where your macrophages come in and do stuff. So you can see here that the macrophages that are going to be doing their work. And of course, rich in red blood cells. Now, the spleen is not well protected. It has a very thin surrounding capsule. And this is one of the organs that has a higher prevalence of hemorrhaging, bleeding during, let's say, a car accident, or as they use here, a direct blow. Now, it is also possible to have bleeding due to an infection, but most likely, like in terms of probabilistically, the occurrence or the scenario that presents of spilling of blood into the peritoneal cavity, it's most likely going to be due to some sort of accident that has occurred that has caused trauma to the spleen. Well, when this occurs, a splenectomy is sometimes done, which is removal of the ruptured spleen. Now, this was a standard protocol for hemorrhaging, bleeding, that's blood going into the peritoneal cavity. Was let's just remove this. Now it's so. Now we've learned that spleen can repair itself. However, please note that just like most things, it is better in younger people, right? So that is another determining factor of whether there's going to be a splenectomy or not. But in younger children, for example, children younger than 12, it has been documented in which the spleen has regenerative properties if a certain portion is left. What happens when a splenectomy is done? We just went over some of the functions. Well, the liver and the bone marrow pick up the slack and they take over in its functions. So let's take a quick look at MALT. So mucosa-associated lymphoid tissues. And these are lymphoid tissues in mucous membranes, right? They're going to be throughout the body. So which ones have this? So we're talking about the lymphatic system, okay? Lymphoid tissues within the lymphatic. Well, which ones have this associated lymphoid tissue, which is mucous membranes around it? Well, you're going to have tonsils, the Peyer's patches, and the appendix. So found in respiratory tract, digestive, right? And we're going to find these as well that contain that. Now, when we take a look at lymphoid organs, the smallest, some of the smallest and simplest are going to be tonsils. Now, there are 4 different types of tonsils, and they are named based on their location. So palatine tonsils, they're posterior end of oral cavity. These are going to be the largest ones. And because they're the largest ones, they're going to be the ones that are more commonly infected, because they're the ones that are able to capture food and food debris, and also capture other types of debris that may contain bacteria. Even through inhalation, that is a possibility. You have lingual tonsils, so the lumpy collection of follicles at base of tongue, pharyngeal tonsils, and tubal tonsils as well. Now, what is the function? And I was kind of leading into that in the other, just the slide that we just passed. So it functions to gather and remove pathogens from food and air. Now, they're not really nice and smooth. So the tonsils, they have these things called tonsillar crypts, and due to those structures, bacteria and particulate matter may enter these crypts, and it's where they're trapped, and sometimes they're destroyed. Now, it is kind of risky, this thing where you're trying to do this, so it's risky to lure bacteria into tissues, but it does allow for the immune system to become more activated and build somewhat of memory cells to the potential pathogens that may be occurring. So kind of a little bit of a double-edged sword there. So this Peyer's patches, what is it? Clusters of lymphoid follicles in the wall of the distal portion of small intestine. So when you think Peyer's patches, you should just be thinking small intestine walls, the small intestines and the walls. What are the functions going to be taking place? Well, they're going to be similar to tonsils, not in the way they look, but in terms of kind of also their function. So you see them and they're able to perform destroy bacteria, preventing bacteria from breaching the intestinal wall, generate memory lymphocytes. And again, when you think of Peyer's patches, we think, boom, small intestine. Okay, the walls. And then we kind of zoom in here in the wall area, and here you can see the Peyer's patches. So the follicles of Peyer's patches. What about this appendix? So it's kind of an offshoot of the first part of the large intestine, and its location aids kind of like Peyer's patches, where it can destroy some bacteria and preventing them from breaching intestinal walls. So also another way of generating memory lymphocytes. So again, taking a look at this, we have our thymus, bone marrow, tonsils, our spleen, our Peyer's patches, and we have our appendix there. So we're going to dive now into this thymus here, right? Kind of a 2-lobe structure. So let's dive into that. So two-lobe, bilobe, same thing, tomato, tomato, potato, potato, bilobe lymphoid organ found in inferior of neck. So when I look at, I put this red here so we can see this as thymus. Think of T, so that is where T cells mature, okay? This is not where B cells mature. There is no B in thymus, so we're not gonna go there. So we need to think T for T cells, thymus for T cells maturing there. Now, functions of thymus, it's going to be most active and largest size during childhood. It stops growing during adolescence and actually gradually atrophies. Now, here is where you're going to still produce immunocompetent cells, though it's going to occur more slowly over time. Now, as I mentioned, it's broken into lobes, right? Two of them that contain an outer cortex and an inner medulla. Well, the cortex, this is the one that contains rapidly dividing lymphocytes and has scattered macrophages. That's the cortex. Well, what about this medulla or inner medulla? This one contains fewer lymphocytes, right? But this is where you're also going to be having regulatory T cell development, right? So it's the type of T cell that helps to prevent the autoimmunity. Now, notice here that in thymus, right? We said thymus is where T cells mature. Well, the thymus is different than other lymphoid organs because the thymus it lacks B cells. Definitely lacks B cells, and it doesn't directly, quote unquote, fight the antigens. Now, again, we have T lymphocyte. This is location T lymphocyte maturing here. This is the only place where the T lymphocytes are going to mature. It does contain a blood thymus barrier, and that's going to keep the immature T lymphocytes kind of cornered there, isolated from any antigens to prevent premature activation, because they're still immature. We don't want them to get involved yet. We want them to reach maturity, and so they can then do what they need to do, right? We also have the stroma made up of epithelial cells, and they are not reticular cells. So here, taking a look a little bit at some histology, we can see the capsule. You have our cortex, the medulla, and the thymic corpuscles. This is a nice little chart that I like. So it's a summary of our lymphoid organs, and so our lymphatic organs. So let's take a look at this. So remember, we covered lymph nodes in part 1. So what does this do? Lymph nodes. Well, remember, we have interstitial fluid. As interstitial fluids enters the lymphatic system, that is when we call it lymph. And the lymph node cleans the lymph, right? So this is also going to be a site where we're going to have some lymphocyte activation and some proliferation occurring here. Now, going to the spleen, I mentioned that doing a little bit of filtration there, a little bit of cleaning going on. So it's going to be cleaning that older blood. So removes the aged ones, older ones, or defective red blood cells. Remember, our red blood cell has to have its right shape. It has to have hemoglobin just right in order for it to do its job. It has to have the heme groups. So it must be a functional red blood cell. When it is not, sometimes it is up to the spleen to do what it needs to do when there is a defective red blood cells. In spleen, again, you can have a same as lymph node. You can have site for lymphocyte activation and proliferation. So we got that in there. But here it can store some platelets, monocytes, and some iron. Now, what about molt? We talked about, we were looking at the mucous membranes, right? Well, I was trying earlier, I was trying to say this is what's it's a barrier for preventing pathogen entrance. And again, just like lymph node, just like spleen, this area is also a site for lymphocyte activation and proliferation. Now here comes in the thymus. And again, T for T cell maturation, okay? So this is where our T cells are going to mature, but it does have the ability to isolate the quote unquote younger ones and to make sure they do not get activated until they reach the proper maturation. And that is the end, ladies and gentlemen, of our part 2 lymphocyte chapter. So that was chapter 20, the lymphatic system, okay? I wish all of you well, and we'll see you soon. I'll post this up right now. Thank you.